Our speaker tonight is a professor of economics at George Mason University. He specializes in the theory and history of monetary and banking institutions. He received his A.B. from Harvard and his Ph.D. from the University of California. He has written several books, and his works have appeared in both professional and popular media outlets. Dr. White is noted for his contribution to the Austrian School of Economics. He has analyzed the theory and history of free banking, a system under which commercial banks and market forces control the provision of banking services. He is currently writing a history of the great economic policy debates of the last 100 years. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Lawrence White.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and I did have a good time at the college this afternoon, and I'm hoping that some of you will ask questions as good as the students asked. And there will be a quiz later, so feel free to take notes. The title I'm assigned, or I guess I volunteered, was what monetary arrangements would be best for the Bahamas. And I don't mean to present myself as an expert on all the ins and outs of local institutions. In fact, I've been learning a lot in the 2 days I've been here. Damien just gave me a copy of the central bank's balance sheet today, so I could get a better idea of what they were up to. They don't put it on their website like most central banks, but apparently it's available if you know where to look. So I want to ask the question of what would be the best monetary arrangements for the Bahamas going forward in the 21st century. And when I say for the Bahamas, I mean for the average citizen of the Bahamas. I don't mean for the tax authorities of the Bahamas or for the comfort of members of the central bank, but what would best serve the interests of people who use money. Let me start with a brief review of the history of Bahamian currency, which you probably don't need to learn from me, but you might want some evidence that I know what I'm talking about, since I am from the mainland. I've done a little bit of homework on this. So the Bahamas had an arrangement known as a currency board from 1919 up to 1968, and it issued notes that were denominated in pounds sterling, of course, and it was a fairly common arrangement in British colonies at the time. And it's an arrangement that is still being practiced in some British territories like Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, Gibraltar. Hong Kong had a sterling currency board up to 1972. They tried floating the Hong Kong dollar. In 1983 they reestablished a currency board, this time linked to the US dollar, because they found floating quite unpleasant. There's an interesting twist in Hong Kong, which I'm going to suggest is not a bad idea, which is that the actual currency notes, the banknotes in Hong Kong, are not issued by the government. They're issued by commercial banks. There is a currency board behind the commercial banks called the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, and that controls the total quantity of notes, but the commercial banks issue them as their liabilities and compete a bit. The system hasn't changed since the authorities decided not to change the system because it was working so well, with the switch back to Chinese governance in 1997. Although there is now a third bank authorized to issue notes in addition to the original two, the new one being the Bank of China. But currency boards are not limited to colonies or former colonies. They've made a comeback in the last 20 years. Among independent nations, and in a minute I'll go into more detail about exactly what a currency board is. There are euro-based currency boards in several countries in Europe. They've been adopted by Estonia, Lithuania, and Bulgaria, among others. And the experience in those countries was similar to Hong Kong. They tried floating their own currency. They quickly decided it was a disaster. And adopted a currency board arrangement where they're tied to the euro. If you want more technical details about the history and practice of currency boards, I recommend going to the website of an economist named Kurt Schuler, who just happens to be a former student of mine, or read the work of Steve Hanke, who in fact co-authors a lot with Kurt Schuler. Steve Hanke has a column in Forbes magazine regularly. So how does a currency board work? There are more or less orthodox currency board arrangements. That is, some arrangements that are kind of like currency boards differ in some ways. So let me talk about an orthodox currency board. It means that local currency notes and coins are issued by a public authority, but unlike a central bank, it doesn't play any other roles. So unlike a central bank, it doesn't take deposits from commercial banks, it doesn't run the interbank clearing system, it doesn't regulate commercial banks, and most importantly for the Bahamas, it doesn't enforce exchange controls. It doesn't act as a lender of last resort, it doesn't conduct a macroeconomic policy. The board issues notes that are redeemable for some anchor currency or reserve currency. Typically the most stable currency available, or the currency of the largest trading partner that's stable. This currency is redeemable for the local currency is redeemable for the anchor currency on demand, at a fixed rate, and in unlimited quantities. Right? So there's no need for exchange controls, or put a little spin on it, the indignity of exchange controls. The norm is two-way convertibility to and from the anchor currency in unlimited amounts, both for merchandise imports and for capital account transactions, imports and exports of foreign securities, or foreign direct investment, or repatriation of earnings by foreign firms. There isn't any need for exchange controls because a currency board is in a position, this is one of the rules governing it, is in a position to buy back every last dollar of local notes. So they never need to restrict convertibility to protect having enough reserves. They always have enough reserves to buy back every last note they issue. The fixed rate between the local currency and the anchor currency doesn't have to be 1-to-1. That has a certain amount of convenience to it. But in Hong Kong, it's 7.8 Hong Kong dollars to 1 US dollar. In the Cayman Islands, it's 1 Cayman dollar equals 1.2 US dollars. There is something attractive about 1-to-1, though, which is a kind of psychological advantage. It makes devaluation that much more striking, that they're breaking the ancient and honorable parity of 1-to-1. So, against its note liabilities, on the other side of the balance sheet, the currency board holds 100% or slightly more reserves in assets, safe assets, issued externally in the anchor currency. So, to be a little less abstract, if we think about a Bahamian currency board with a US dollar anchor, it would it would hold Federal Reserve notes for part of its reserves, for its cash reserves, but then also as part of its reserves it would have US Treasury bonds, or something equally safe, and the total of these two, the cash and the Treasury bonds, would equal or exceed the value of the Bahamian dollars in circulation. So that's the sense in which they'd be able to buy back every last Bahamian dollar. So there's a very simple and direct constraint on how adventuresome a currency board can be, which is not at all. It can't expand the circulation of local notes until someone brings it an external currency unit to swap. So if the exchange rate is 1-to-1, only when somebody brings in 100 US dollars could a Bahamian currency board issue more Bahamian notes. Could the local circulation expand by $100? And if somebody brings in $50 of Bahamian currency to redeem for US dollars, the circulation of their notes, Bahamian notes, shrinks by $50. This eliminates any scope for monkeying with the money supply, for discretionary domestic monetary policy. So they basically just supply the quantity of currency people want to hold. They don't try to do anything else. They don't try to influence interest rates.